my plan is to complete the presentation of Luigi Barzini's book on the raid from Beijing to Paris and the significance for societies in Western Europe and the representation of the automotive technology as the new global product that is about to invade all markets and change drastically all ecosystems. On Thursday, I want to catch up with you on the whatever progress you're making for the final project, answer any questions, talk again about the final exam and the oral presentation, and we'll watch another series of scenes from the movie Le Mans. Okay? As you know, there are no written assignments between now and the end of the semester, no more weekly assignments, because this way you're free to devote some of your time to the preparation of your final project. Besides the PDF that I used last week, I'll be using also some of the excerpts collected in this presentation that you find linked both under week 11 and week 12. In order to resume our conversation about Barzini, I want to go back to the very beginning of the book, which is an introduction by Prince Scipione Borghese, the owner and driver of the Itala car that reached Paris ahead of all the other vehicles that had left Beijing in June 1907. This introduction probably was written by Barzini himself. Possibly the prince gave him some points during a conversation, and then the journalist did the rest as a form of respect and homage to this new modern hero. But what's interesting about the introduction, as you see here, is that they make no mystery that their journey from Beijing to Paris was not entirely successful. And this brings us back to the pattern we identified in many of the narratives about technology, both short stories and novels, where, as you know, we start with anticipation often of the changes brought forth by the adoption of the new technology. And then there is a phase of seduction and fascination, which can be combined often with negative effects of the endorsement of the technology, often characterized, presented in the form of loss of control or other forms of chaos caused by the novelty of the technology. And finally, there may be a phase of rupture, but finally there is either the separation from the technology or the endorsement, the adoption, the full embracing of the technology. In this case, the introduction, the book itself, begins by saying, we, meaning the people who traveled with the Itala car from Beijing to Paris, we can give some credence to the opinions of those who say that it cannot be done. Let's read from the beginning of this slide. There are people who say that our journey, this is the prince, the owner of the car and one of the drivers, speaking to the journalist Barzini, people who say that our journey has proved one thing above all others, namely that it is impossible to go by motor car from Pekin to Paris. And he adds that it's a paradox because clearly we've done it. So how can you say that? But he says there is a Byzantine flavor to it. And if you're familiar with the adjective Byzantine, it means that if you analyze deeply this statement, you can find that there are ways you can argue in favor of the veracity of such a bold statement. Because he adds, you cannot comfortably go from Beijing to Paris, you have to step out of your car. They knew that they had to rely on other means, and that in fact, at the present time, at the time of the book, a car service between Beijing and Paris, between China and France, cannot be established. The book will in fact offer photographic evidence of that impossibility, but in reference to the pattern applicable and often applied to the representation of technologies, there are all the elements we listed before earlier, because the book doesn't begin with the journey itself. The cars will leave Beijing at a much later stage, a third or so into the book, maybe a little more. But at the beginning, there is this sense of great anticipation. The very beginning of the book is when Barzini, who's home reading a book about American trains and American railroads, hear the phone ringing. Of course, technology is represented in different ways: the telegraph, the telephone, the automobile. And on the other end of the phone line, there is the editor of Corriere della Sera, Albertini, a great journalist from the period, who is summoning the journalist Barzini at once in the offices, in the main headquarters in Milan of Corriere della Sera. So Barzini takes a taxi cab and goes there thinking maybe there is a new war or some kind of catastrophic event or emergency that I need to cover, because Barzini was a foreign affairs journalist. And then he finds out that Albertini wants him to cover this journey and provide full coverage of this adventure. And within a matter of days from the phone call, Barzini is leaving Italy to go to France, then will get on a ship to go to the US, will cover a few events in New York City, including a trial with famous characters from the New York elites involved. He will travel across the United States all the way to San Francisco, get on a ship to, I think he stopped in Japan, and then China. And there only he will join Prince Borghese, his mechanician. The onboard mechanic traveling on a car during that period was called mechanician in English. And eventually, in June, they will finally leave Pekin. So the anticipation is simply, in this case, the build-up to a point where you get to realize that the world is on the verge of a radical change that will affect entire civilizations. In fact, part of the anticipation is a discussion of East versus West. The feeling, whatever you can feel while staying in Pekin, in Beijing before the beginning of this unusual race, which is often, in the words and the descriptions of Barzini, a sense of immobility. The idea that Chinese civilization is a great civilization, but they have shied away from industrialization, technological change in favor of stability. But this stability has turned into stasis, right? The rejection of any sense of progress. So the building up is based on the assumption that the introduction of the automobile, after all, 1907 is right at the cusp of the industrial mass production of cars. Model T will come in a matter of months, that this change will affect the entire world, right? This is one of those passages. There are several. I've included some here. To feel Pekin around you is like feeling yourself launch backwards through time to some remote, immutable form of life fixed long ages ago. Remote meaning far from the center of civilization, which is clearly the places mentioned in the first page after the title of Le Matin, the French newspaper that organized the race from Beijing to Paris, where it says, this is a newspaper based on the wires, on the telegrams from the 4 major cities in the world: Paris, Berlin, London, and New York. And backwards in time, because progress is about technology. And there is a strong belief, after all, we, people from living in this 21st century, just believe that it is natural for past generations and societies, 120 years ago, to make this shift from, let's say, the use of animals for mobility to the use of cars. And we assume that it was for the better, that there was no other choice. But in fact, this belief that we now feel it was natural is presented as an opinion, as an idea in this book. Okay? And we should not forget this. We are on the verge of another change with the massive use and circulation of AI. And once again, we believe that the decision has been made, that we are just passive consumers, that we have no agency, no power over the choice. And the same way that we believe that it was natural to move from horses to automobiles, we may be led to believe that it's natural to change and leave behind a world in which human brains were indispensable, and now they're partially or almost totally replaced by artificial intelligence. So keep these considerations in mind, okay? But if you read the rest of the description, you have the sense of, for example, the languor, this torpid state of civilization and society being replaced by not just technology, but the dimension associated with the new technology of the automobile, which is speed. Because speed is just a staple of modernity, right? It's not simply when you're traveling on an automobile that you experience speed. Speed becomes second nature to life, existence. For example, a journalist is someone who lives speed in different ways. The way he, for example, goes from reading a book to just a few days later leaving for a trip around the world with just minimal preparation, right? Speed is the way we live at this point. So the automobile is modern in different ways. Now, the book itself is about efficiency, the efficiency of automobile as a means of transportation. So plenty of times you find references in the narrative and pictures to the outdated modalities of transportation of supplies between China, Siberia, and Russia, between East and West, right? In this case, you see a caravan in the desert. But keep in mind that overall the book is a kind of marketing operation to market the automobile as the only efficient replacement for this kind of lifestyle. And the book does that indirectly. For example, in here, and by contrast, you find other pictures where you see the automobile. And sometimes they do it directly with pictures that become allegories of the changes from the past to the future. For example, in here you find another caravan and near Urga in Mongolia, and the caption reads, "Carts of the past and carts of the future." And clearly, to make this more symbolic, it appears that the caravan is going in one direction and the car, the automobile, in the opposite direction. There is no alternative, right? There is no world in which you can have hybrid modes of transportation, parts with animals, parts with trucks. But the illusion is that efficiency is topped. The top of the efficiency is represented by vehicles. And clearly there are plenty of times, for example, when they step from Mongolia into Siberia, where the car can be used efficiently, reaching speed of 50 miles, perhaps even faster. The car did not have a speedometer, so whatever references you find to speed, to the actual speed in the book, they're just estimates by the people on board. Of course, this is the prince, this is Ettore Guizzardi, driver and owner, Scipione Borghese, Ettore Guizzardi, mechanician, and second driver, or perhaps first driver. And all the pictures are being taken by Barzini, the journalist himself. References to the strategic value of vehicles, such as this automobile, on a global scale, are found in the book and especially in the introduction. One thing that strikes the reader in the introduction is the reference to the many discussions wherever the car stopped and they spent the night in a town or a city. Scipione Borghese and the others were invited to dinners, to banquets by the local elites, by the local upper classes. And there are many references to conversations that took place around the table. And the conversations were not just about the future of the automobile, but the future of the economy in those areas where automobiles were virtually absent, thanks to motorized transportation. However, as I said, even in this narrative, there are setbacks. There are moments where they experience loss of control or lack of control. They have to step out of the car, and they make no mystery about that. They write about it from the very first page of the introduction. They offer plenty of pictures to document how, after driving out of the city of Beijing, they often have, they travel actually. First of all, we have to say they travel at low speeds, while the porters, or as they were called in China during that period, the coolies, travel with them, so that whenever the automobile cannot be driven over a mountain pass, such as in this example, humans can pull the car with ropes. Okay, so this entire mission was accomplished in a hybrid form, thanks to an engine, but also thanks to human strength. So the transformation is very much transitional, not radical. Yet there are no doubts in this book that the future belongs to vehicles and there is no room for human or animal strength. In reference to setbacks and loss of control, don't forget this dramatic episode when the crew of the Itala car, which is about to travel from Siberia into eastern Russia, goes across one of the many wooden bridges they found on their roads, and they would always advance very slowly on these decrepit bridges. They were very aware of the fact that their car weighed about 2 tons, plus they had more than 100 gallons of fuel on board, oil, water, supplies, etc. And at some point, one of those bridges collapses, and as you can see, it collapses so quickly that the car goes down. And of this too, we have plenty of pictures. In here, you can see how people, probably people from the area, maybe this could be Ettore, the mechanician, but I believe this is just a local farmer. Don't forget that the prince was speaking fluent in Russian. And you can see how they're trying to get all the stuff that normally was carried on the back of the automobile. They were trying to get that out to recover everything. And you can really get a sense of how strong the car was if it survived such an accident halfway through. There were rocks in this brook under the bridge. In fact, Barzini hit his head on those rocks. Clearly, from the descriptions in the pages, he must have suffered a head trauma that would have warranted hospitalization, but he decided to continue, even though the prince wanted to take him to a hospital. He didn't want to slow them down. He was afraid they would leave him behind. And look at the next picture. You can see in here how they took apart the whole bridge, because clearly the bridge at this point is useless and cannot be trusted. And they want the car to be able to go over some of the pylons and then get on the street. They have ropes. We know from the narrative that they tied the ropes to trees. So they're trying to create a rudimentary pulley to recover the car. Okay. And probably this is the prince, and probably this is Ettore, the mechanician. It's not only what you've seen in here, the need for humans to use ropes to pull the car over Chinese mountain passes, the dramatic accident over a collapsed due to a collapsed bridge in eastern Russia. But constantly we see the car sinking in mud because the roads are not made for vehicles of this nature, and for the wheels, right? They had carriages with wheels with a different radius that were able to better navigate these conditions. So you see over and over again the car sank in mud in pictures and in the narratives. Oh, I skipped over one. Stuck again in mud. Sinking again with people around. Sinking again in Irkutsk. And through these pictures, besides the issues with the car, you have to grasp the context and the significance of the context, because you constantly have people around the car when it's stuck. The car becomes the object of a pilgrimage, and you have different kinds of people. People come in with bicycles, with carriages, people clearly from the upper classes, the middle classes. Usually somebody with a bicycle would be a middle class person, and other people from the area. So the pictorial section of the book and some of the narrative descriptions are not just about the car, they're about people coming in contact with the new technology, because this is the future. And as I said, many different ethnic groups and different standings, different social classes, different genders are being represented in these pictures, right? It's a whole community coming to observe the car. In this case, is somebody from the Kyrgyz ethnic group, or in this case, a Mongolian family. In this case, it's just women from a village. And in other pictures, you found at the margin of this also men. And then you find the rendering of this. You find the symbolic value of those pictures in passages such as this one, this near Urga, where they found the caravans. The Itala, the car, was the goal of an innocent and fantastic pilgrimage, where innocent means that the people are not really fully aware of the significance of the new technology and how it will affect their future. And fantastic, it means that the view of the car prompts a fantastic voyage, makes their imagination run wild. But it's a pilgrimage, right? Pilgrimage meaning that the car itself is a new fetish for society. All the crowd stood around the car with respectful admiration as before a sacred mystery. So technology is the new religion. It has not just efficiency and economic advantages, profit on its side, there is also a spiritual component. It's able to move people inside in different ways. This is later on in Siberia, another description of the reaction of the locals to the passage of the car. Some expressed the greatest surprise. They seemed stunned. So, for a moment they're frozen and let their tools fall from their hands in their astonishment. So, the apparition of the car is such that all they can do is stare at the car. They're compelled to interrupt their work. Others run gaily to look at the car, as a crowd runs to look at some harmless but strange phenomenon. Again, harmless because they don't know exactly how their future will be affected by this new technology, and strange because clearly it's different from whatever they've seen or experienced up to that point in their lives, or at a troop of itinerant mountebanks passing with their caravan. A few fled. Of course, the acrobats and street performers are the crew of the Itala itself. They're seen as something exotic. And keep in mind that during this period and up until the 1940s, early 50s, a lot of places in the world would have street performers, circuses, acrobats going from place to place and performing in various locales. Of course, the last section was a few fled. That would be a representation of the separation from technology. I see this, but I don't want it in my life. But when we stopped, and the stops are both when they stop to sleep somewhere, to resupply, to refuel, but also when they're stuck in mud, when they have issues, everyone was reassured and approached us. And a moment later, they would treat both ourselves and our car with the most friendly familiarity. So the previous passage becomes, in a way, the anticipation of the technology before they get familiar with it. And the second is the positive interaction with it, or the fascination, the seduction component. The younger generation, so those who live a technological future, admiring the machine and putting very pertinent questions to us concerning its speed and its strength. So the younger spectators, even though they haven't experienced the car, this might be their first experience, they're getting an education. They're not passive. They're engaging with the people on the automobile, which means, yes, this technology can in fact be a global technology, because even the people who've relied on horses, whose existences have relied just on the animals, sheep, cows, etc., and agriculture, they seem to be ready to jump on the wagon of technological change. One of the passages that expresses the symbolic significance of the passage of the automobile through these areas happens when they go through Mongolia. And in here, the conditions of the terrain are such that they can finally, they leave the coolies behind. They know they won't need the ropes pulling the car, and they can finally go fast. And you find this passage, which is a poetic celebration of speed, and at the same time a political connection is established between speed and the civilization of the West. We feel the pride, so they're going at 50 miles per hour or faster, and this is the feeling by the journalist on board the car. We feel the pride of a civilization and a race. The civilization of Europe overshadows us. It is resumed, meaning summarized, and symbolized by the speed of our flight, because the speed becomes a reference for quick progress. The great longings of the Western soul, its strength, the true secret of all its progress is resumed in a short word: faster. Our life is pursued by this violent desire, this painful insatiability, this sublime obsession: faster. So the car is the new symbol of modernity. It is the best representation or allegory of modernity, because progress and speed, the quick pace of progress, represent overall the core values of Western civilization. And it's easy to imagine how someone who wrote these words could then lend his support to fascism, which is also in many ways more of a praxis than an ideology. In a famous article about perennial fascism, Urfascism, Umberto Eco would write that fascism in Italy didn't really have much of an ideology, but it's an ideology that recommends acting, right? Deciding, embracing progress and growth. Now, again, when you go through the book, you find many references to the commercial potential that vehicles have and how commerce will change, how the caravans will be replaced by the car, for example, by vehicles, by trucks, reducing the 17 days record of the swiftest caravans to 4 days journey. So they, with Itala, traveled in 4 days the distance of 17 days with a caravan. They call it rapid mode of transit. But again, don't underestimate the traditional means of transportation. They were not that slow and inefficient. One episode that is highlighted in the introduction, before the entire long chronicle of this journey, is one where in Irkutsk they have a merchant who is invited, because he's so enthusiastic, so excited, is invited to drive with them, ride with them for a while, for a few hours, to the next city, and is overtaken by enthusiasm. So once again, we find in here references to biological and similar terms, biological reactions, phenomena, to express this enthusiasm, the intoxication of that mad flight. The mad flight means the ride at high speed over the good dry roads at Siberia, where this is an indirect reference to every time they got stuck in mud, they were sinking in mud. So how is this significant as an episode, which is very short, in fact? I'll show you later. It is significant because it represents how people will be captured by the new technology. That the new technology is not just about efficiency of transportation, but it also provokes a deeper reaction in the people who use and operate the automobile. Surely he harbors the germ of the motor car passion, intoxication, germ. And in the good season, over those past tracks of land in Siberia, the possibilities of the motor car are endless. And this is the episode. I screenshotted the actual pages of the book. The name of the merchant is Radionov, who was now being initiated, so they're already traveling with this passenger on board, initiated, now the language from biology goes into the semantic field of religion, initiation, was being initiated for the first time into the inebriating joys of velocity. So this idea that you cannot resist the lure of the car, that seduction, rapture are part of the success of this technology, was uttering cries of wonder and enthusiasm. There is a physical and emotional reaction to this ride. At every longer flight of the car, so the faster we went, he fervently reaffirmed, fervently, again from religion, fervor, his intention to get a motor car himself. So he's initiated and he makes this profession of faith in the technology. Now notice the following sentences. He should have one at once. He would order it as soon as he got back home to Irkutsk. He would telegraph for one. Speed, right? You order your car via telegraph the same way that you would use the Amazon or online platforms now to get something, a product, more quickly delivered to you. He would have one identically like ours. This is typical of a phenomenon from the period that I've called neophilia. That is to say, the fact that people want a new product, they want it right away, they want exactly a certain kind of product, because once they have experienced the product they don't own, once they can imagine themselves and their lives being changed by the new product, there are no ways they can continue living their old lives, right? And we found that, for example, at the beginning of the Lightning Conductor, when Molly Randolph sees cars in England, then she goes on a ride, she meets the owner of the car, and she feels smaller. She feels that her life is now diminished by the lack of the possession and ownership of the car. Now, the rest of the episode is about the passenger who forgets about the car, apparently, and takes out sandwiches. He eats sandwiches himself and then passes the food to the journalist, the mechanician, and the prince. And it may be a counterpoint, right? Counterintuitive, going from this initiation to the sandwiches. I find it interesting because it's a continuation of the physicality of the experience. He's not reflecting on it. There is something visceral in his attachment to the car, and there is continuity between this visceral reaction and hunger. This is where this happened. Irkutsk is here. You see Siberia. You see Paris at the end of the itinerary, Africa in here, China, right? And this is Le Matin, right? A good chunk, the central portion of the first page of Le Matin is devoted to this challenge, this fabulous challenge, this trip. At this point, they've traveled 4,000 kilometers, about 2,500 miles, roughly, right? And you can see the rest of the journey. And once again, it seems almost linear, but it was not as linear as it appears in here. You find the mountains separating Siberia from Russia, marked in here with crosses and lines, the Urals, okay? And this is the area where they had the bridge accident. But the title is Irkutsk is celebrating, right? Celebrating the arrival of the automobile. So you can appreciate what I was saying before. This is also a giant marketing campaign for the car to support the idea that the car is a global product. This is also reiterated in the introduction. The introduction, in some ways, is the manifesto for the book and the automobile. And the prince in here is saying that they tested the automobile, and the book is about the automobile. Our persons, meaning the people who were on the car that went from Beijing to Paris, the names of the machines were matters of secondary importance. This is just a parable about the successful testing of the automobile. Our car represented the European science of motor production, meaning this is a product that is now ready for mass production. And insistence on civilization, right? The civilized world was witnessing the amplest, completest, the most persuasive testing to which this new instrument of its own making had ever been subjected. And in many ways, the car, the Itala, is the protagonist of the book, right? And this is one of the passages that supports that idea. And it's so much of a protagonist that when they talk about testing the car, this being a successful test, they go through every single part of the car. Its frame was shaken by jerks and jolting during these 10,000 miles. Its engine was taxed on the steep ascents, where the wheels skidded on the sand, right? Its carburetor was working often under normal condition. Its gear and transmission shafts were subject to frequent and abrupt changes. The clutch at every moment engaged or free. So they go through the whole list of components the same way that when in the introduction they introduce Ettore, the mechanician on board the Itala, they go through every single skill that he brought to the car and every single aspect of his work, all his duties, right? Working under the frame, examining, testing, registering, tightening the nuts, the screws. But also notice how Ettore becomes the impersonation, the representation of the symbiotic interaction with the car, right? After 14, 16, 18 hours of travel, during which clenched teeth and tense nerves, he, Ettore, had listened for the slightest sound of the engine, the slightest creaking of the car, fighting for its very existence against the difficulties of the ground, he, Ettore, at the end of his day on the car, would spend 2 or 3 hours working under the frames. So this is the allegory of humans becoming an extension of the car. Ettore lives on the car or under the car for, it is claimed here, 75% of his time. And therefore, he himself is the prototype of the new humanities that will have to interact constantly with technologies. Imagine what we read about Ettore being applied to your existence as an appendix to your smartphone, and how some of you may spend 15 or even 18 hours connected to your phone, right? At the same time, this has to be adapted to a view of a conservative society, right? Because the idea that Ettore can work on the car so well grant him some merit. And meritocracy is a value in this kind of society, and therefore the skills that Ettore has displayed will make him socially mobile, right? He'll be rewarded with different standing in society. However, notice what is said in the second half of this. He gives his intelligent service. He's still a servant, even though a competent, specialized one, with the disinterestedness and the loyalty of a friend to one who has been able to inspire him with trust, his master, the prince, right? So even the prototype of the new humanity interacting symbiotically with technology has to acknowledge that a prince is a prince. And there is no questioning of authority even in this new technological society, right? And whom he believes capable of appreciating his great qualities of mind and heart. So the prince is recognizing that Ettore is a special human endowed with great skills, probably better able to work with technology than he himself, but Ettore is appreciating the leadership of the prince as positive to society in general. This is a later passage where Barzini himself talks about Ettore, the mechanician, and once again, the biographical profile of Ettore becomes an allegory for the beginning of a new humanity. He goes through the story of how he was working with his father, had an accident, was taken by the prince under his wings. But notice what is being said about Ettore. A chauffeur, a driver, not by training, but by nature. This is a deep statement, meaning that nature endowed Ettore with the skills that are needed to operate the machinery. This is rewriting technological development from the point of view of evolution, meaning Ettore might not have been as successful in the Middle Ages, but in the 20th century, he was given by nature the right skills to become successful. He's the son of a railway mechanic, genetics, right? The father was a mechanic, the son is a mechanic, and has been familiar with machines from his early childhood. Familiar, meaning that he has developed in an ecosystem where technology were represented. He understands all kinds of them at once and judges them at a glance, meaning he has this innate, intuitive powers. And his history is a singular one, and then he goes through the story of the accident, the train accident, how he's lost his father, found a mentor, right? And notice how they had mentioned his name at the beginning, then through the rest of the short episode, the name is not mentioned, only at the end. That lad in the story was Ettore, and the dead man is father. Ettore here is the new Ettore, who has lost a father, found a mentor, and a career, has been born to a new series of experiences. And this is the list of the skills provided by nature and developed by Ettore with the help of the patronage from the prince. He creates, modifies, applies new mechanisms to motor engines, could, if occasion offered, give excellent advice to motor building firms. He's full of resource, can remedy immediately any accident to his machine. He's ever ready with brain and tool. So it's not just an artisan, someone good with his hands. This is a new profession that requires new skills. And then, as we found in the passage, assigned to the prince, there is this sense that, okay, new societies will have new classes of professionals, but let's not imagine that there will be a revolution ever. He moves silently, Ettore, with something of a soldier's way. What's the main virtue of a soldier? Obedience, right? To a call, when he's called, he replies, "Comandi, at your orders, sir," right? So even the future with new technological roles that will grant social mobilities to people from the lower classes will not unsettle unsettle the leadership if and when the leadership is occupied by people such as Prince Borghese, who's a leader by society, by family, through his blood, and by nature because he has clearly leadership skills. And this is the top. This tops it all to me. So read how this is the reinterpretation of the same passage as before, right? In the first time, we read how Ettore was spending 15 or more hours on the car and then 2 or 3 hours under the car. This is how it is re-proposed to the reader a few tens of pages later. The first time that I saw him, that Barzini saw Ettore, he was lying on his back under the Itala, the car, motionless with folded arms. I thought for a moment that he was working, but no, he was at play. And later I found that that is one of his favorite postures, a way he has of taking recreation. When he has nothing special on hand, he stretches himself out under his motor car and contemplates it, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, screw by screw, in long, strange colloquy with his machine. Why I find this striking? Because anyone who has read one of the chief texts about the Renaissance will remember that in the Lives of the Artists by Vasari, in the chapter devoted to Leonardo da Vinci, there is one episode which epitomizes the new model for the artist. Because the whole book, the whole collection of the Lives by Vasari has one thesis at its core, that the artist is, the modern artist, the Renaissance artist, is an intellectual. That is to say, not just someone good with his hands, whether it be for a painting or a sculpture, but someone who applies his mind to the creation of art as much as their hands. And the episode I'm referring to is the following. Leonardo is painting the famous Last Supper, which you can find in Santa Maria delle Grazie in Milan. And as it was customary, Leonardo, working on this, it took him a couple of years for the fresco of the Last Supper, big wall, right? And as it was customary, the artist was being paid by the time, not an amount for the painting, but rather a certain amount by month. So in this episode, the head of the convent goes to Leonardo complaining because Leonardo, he finds spending hours just looking at the wall. And the head of the convent threatens to go to the Duke of Milan to complain that Leonardo is defrauding him because he's being paid just to watch the wall, just to be lost in reflection. And Vasari adds that, of course, Leonardo didn't pay the consequences of this because it was the head of the convent who couldn't appreciate that the modern artist works with his mind, that Leonardo, simply contemplating the wall, was imagining the scene and how he would represent the scene of the Last Supper. So this is the Renaissance of technology. In here you find someone who's under the car, contemplating the car, because he's being transformed symbiotically, is one mind and body with the technology itself. So in this sense, Ettore is being celebrated as the man of the new Renaissance brought forth by technologies. Don't forget that we appreciate how much of the whole operation was marketing through the fact that the book came out between 1907 and 1908 in several languages. This is the original Italian version with, as it is specified in the cover, 126 illustrations, 13 tables, and a map. And the title is half of the world seen from an automobile, and then it says from Beijing to Paris in 60 days. Right? The title some of the title is lost in the British translation. Notice how already 1907, which is the same year when they did this, the book was coming out in different languages to celebrate this. 1907 is the year when a lot of books come out everywhere about the automobile, because as I said, between 1907 and 1908, the automobile was about to become a mass product. They were about to go from a few thousands of cars produced per country to hundreds of thousands and millions in just a couple of years. This is an example. Another journalist, an intellectual, Mario Morasso, the new mechanical aspect of the world, right? The idea that the new world, the future, will appear to be mechanical, meaning technological, and it's a celebration. The editor is the same, by the way, as Barzini's books. The idea here is that speed is the new dimension, that the future will be inhabited by technologies of different kinds. At the same time, of course, during this period, books about love and the automobile, motor romance books and short stories were being published in large numbers. 1907 is when the play we read, which was staged in 1904, was published, right? So these things were not random occurrences. 1907 is when you find this other book by a journalist / intellectual in Italy, Carlo Placci, called On the Automobile, which is a celebration of tourism with the automobile, where, as you can appreciate even just from the illustration, the driving man appears to be a magical creature, right? Because if you look at the clouds in here, these of course are clouds of smoke and dust around the car, but isn't this the same kind of representation you would find in religious iconography for saints, for the Virgin, for Jesus? Because reality has disappeared, right? It's just a dark background and the clouds and the driver central, as Jesus would be central to a representation. And as I said, it's about going around to see very antique places, right? You find this very old bridge and mountains typical of Italy. The contrast between the modernity of the vehicle and the antiquities that are being explored. And once again, another illustration from the same book. You can appreciate through the use of the goggles in the portrait how the driver becomes a different kind of human. You cannot see their eyes, not because they're in the car. In fact, in this case, the portrait is a floating head surrounded by garlands. It's just that the goggles are intrinsic, they're integral to the being of the driver. Only with the goggles, he can be appreciated as a new kind of creature. Okay, so this was the last slide, but I'm not dismissing you as early as 3 p.m. I'll circulate the attendance. I will welcome any comments or questions, but since I finished and I was able to do everything ahead of time, we can perhaps see another scene or two from Le Mans, the film from 1971. So let me go there. So, any questions about today's presentation, or if you were here on Thursday when we watched the first 30 minutes or so of Le Mans, Do you have any questions about the film itself, about the plot, the characters, anything that I can clarify for you? If you remember what we saw in the first 30 minutes or so, which are almost completely devoid of dialogues, of cinematic dialogues, theatrical dialogues, we see the character of Michael Delaney, a professional driver, professional race car driver, coming to Le Mans, stopping at the site of an accident where another driver, Piero Belghetti, the husband of Lisa, the male protagonist of the film, was killed, and Michael himself was seriously injured. And then we see just the preparations for the race. All the people converge into the racetrack, people who have spent the night at the racetrack in anticipation for the race, in tents or just sleeping on the ground. We see the preparation of the drivers themselves, the mechanics in the pit stop area. And now it's almost 4 p.m. on Saturday when the race is about to start. And the last preparation have to do with the drivers getting into the cars, putting their seatbelts, getting help with their seatbelts. And again, we go from this documentary style approach to the story, which is all visual, with background noise, with some of the music soundtrack, to the start of the race, where to signify the symbiotic interaction between cars and drivers, you go from the heartbeat of the drivers, who are, of course, tense before the start of the race, which is one of the most dangerous moments, to the beating of the engines, right? The two sounds will merge into one another. And following that, for the next 10 or 15 minutes, you just have the cars going around. Some of the images were shot in June 1970, when Paul Newman, when Steve McQueen and his crew went there and even had a car going around with cameras. And it's just the race and the pit stops with, again, very limited dialogue.